The Batavia was a Dutch East India Company ship that set sail from the port of Texel, Netherlands in October 1628, bound for the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. The ship was commanded by Francisco Pelsaert, with Ariaen Jacobsz as the skipper. The ship was carrying a large amount of valuable cargo, including coins, trade goods, and weapons, as well as around 340 passengers and crew. On June 4, 1629, the Batavia struck a reef off the coast of Western Australia, near the Houtman Abrolhos Islands. The ship quickly foundered and sank, but most of the passengers and crew were able to make it to shore on the ship's longboats. However, the supplies on the ship were limited and the survivors soon found themselves stranded on the islands without adequate food or water. In the following days, Pelsaert set sail on one of the longboats in search of help, leaving Jacobsz in charge of the survivors. But with the skipper Ariaen Jacobsz being a cruel and dishonest man, he took advantage of Pelsaert's absence to exert his authority over the survivors, and soon a sort of dictatorship was established. He began to hoard the limited supplies for himself and his inner circle, and he began to sexually assault and abuse the women on the islands. As the weeks passed, the situation on the islands grew increasingly desperate. Many of the survivors fell ill due to exposure and lack of proper food and water, and many died. Meanwhile, Jacobsz's tyranny continued to grow, as he and his men began to physically attack and kill those who dared to stand up to him. Finally, in late July, Pelsaert returned with help, but by that time, the situation on the islands had spiraled out of control. Pelsaert found that over 100 of the original survivors were dead and many were injured, and he immediately arrested Jacobsz and several of his men on charges of murder and mutiny. Pelsaert then had him transported to Batavia, Jakarta, to face trial for their crimes. Jacobsz and several of his men were eventually found guilty and were hanged, and the others were punished accordingly. The Batavia disaster was one of the worst shipwrecks in the history of the Dutch East India Company, both in terms of lives lost and the subsequent events on the islands. In addition to the human tragedy, the Batavia shipwreck also had a significant impact on the history of Western Australia. The wreck was not discovered until the 20th century, and the findings of the artifacts and treasures have provided valuable insights into the early days of European exploration and colonization of Australia.